Note K. Child murder. The Scottish Statute Book Anno 1690 Chapter 21, in consequence of the great increase of the crime of child murder, both from the temptations to commit the offence and the difficulty of discovery, enacted a certain set of presumptions, which in the absence of direct proof, the jury were directed to receive as evidence of the crime having actually been committed. The circumstances selected for this purpose were that the woman should have concealed her situation during the whole period of pregnancy, that she should not have called for help at her delivery, and that combined with these grounds of suspicion, the child should be either found dead or be altogether missing. Many persons suffered death during the last century under this severe act, but during the author's memory, a more lenient course was followed, and the female accused under the act, and conscious of no competent defense, usually lodged a petition to the Court of Justiciary denying for form's sake the tenor of the indictment, but stating that as her good name had been destroyed by the charge, she was willing to submit to sentence of banishment, to which the Crown Council usually consented. This lenity in practice and the comparative infrequency of the crime, since the doom of public ecclesiastical penance has been generally dispensed with, have led to the abolition of the Statute of William and Mary, which is now replaced by another imposing banishment in those circumstances in which the crime was formerly capital. This alteration took place in 1803. Note Roman 50 Calumniator of the fair sex. The Journal of Graves, a Bow Street officer dispatched to Highland to obtain the surrender of the unfortunate William Brodie, bears a reflection on the ladies somewhat like that put in the mouth of the police officer Sharpitlaw. It had been found difficult to identify the unhappy criminal, and when a Scotch gentleman of respectability had seemed disposed to give evidence on the point, required his son-in-law, a clergyman in Amsterdam, and his daughter were suspected by Graves to have used arguments with the witness to dissuade him from giving his testimony, on which subject the Journal of the Bow Street officer proceeds thus. Saw then a manifest reluctance in Mr. and had no doubt the daughter and parson would endeavour to persuade him to decline troubling himself in the matter, but judged he could not go back from what he had said to Mr. Rich. Nota bene, no mischief, but a woman or a priest in either both. Note Roman 1000 Sir William Dick of Braid. This gentleman formed a striking example of the instability of human prosperity. He was once the wealthiest man of his time in Scotland, a merchant in an extensive line of commerce, and a farmer of the public revenue, insomuch that about 1640 he estimated his fortune at £200,000 sterling. Sir William Dick was a zealous covenanter, and in the memorable year 1641 he lent the Scottish Convention of Estates 100,000 merks at once, and thereby enabled them to support and pay their army, which must otherwise have broken to pieces. He afterwards advanced for the service of King Charles during the usurpation, and having by owning the royal cause provoked the displeasure of the ruling party, he was fleeced of more money, amounting in all to sterling. Being in this manner reduced to indigence, he went to London to try to recover some part of the sums which had been lent on government security. Instead of receiving any satisfaction, the Scottish Croesus was thrown into prison, in which he died 19th December 1655. It is said his death was hastened by the want of common necessaries, but this statement is somewhat exaggerated if it be true, as is commonly said, that though he was not supplied with bread, he had plenty of pie crust, thence called Sir William Dick's necessity. The changes of fortune are commemorated in a folio pamphlet entitled The Lamentable Estate and Distressed Case of Sir William Dick Land, 1656. It contains 3 copper plates, one representing Sir William on horseback and attended with guards as Lord Provost of Edinburgh, superintending the unloading of one of his rich argosies, a second exhibiting him as arrested, and in the hands of the bailiffs, a third presents him dead in prison. The tract is esteemed highly valuable by collectors of prints. The only copy I ever saw upon sale was rated at L in London sales. Copies have varied in price from L to L10s. Note N. Doomster or Dempster of Court. The name of this officer is equivalent to the pronouncer of doom or sentence in this comprehensive sense. The judges of the Isle of Man were called Dempsters, but in Scotland The word was long restricted to the designation of an official person whose duty it was to recite the sentence after it had been pronounced by the court and recorded by the clerk on which occasion. The Dempster legalized it by the words of form, and this I pronounce for doom for a length of years. The office as mentioned in the text was held in commandum with that of the executioner, for when this odious but necessary officer of justice received his appointment, he petitioned the court of justiciary to be received as their Dempster, which was granted as a matter of course. The production of the executioner in open court, and in presence of the wretched criminal, had something in it hideous and disgusting to the more refined feelings of later times. But if an old tradition of the Parliament House of Edinburgh may be trusted, it was the following anecdote which occasioned the disuse of the Dempster's office. It chanced at one time that the office of public executioner was vacant. There was occasion for someone to act as Dempster, and considering the party who generally held the office, it is not wonderful that a locum tenens was hard to be found. At length one Hume, who had been sentenced to transportation for an attempt to burn his own house, was induced to consent that he would pronounce the doom on this occasion, but when brought forth to officiate, instead of repeating the doom to the criminal Mr. Hume addressed himself to their lordships in a bitter complaint of the injustice of his own sentence. It was in vain that he was interrupted and reminded of the purpose for which he had come hither. I can. What ye want of me, Weel Enug, said the fellow, ye want me to be your Dempster. But I am come to be none of your Dempster. I am come to summon you Lord T, and you Lord E, to answer at the bar of another world for the injustice you have done me in this. In short, Hume had only made a pretext of complying with the proposal in order to have an opportunity of reviling the judges to their faces, or giving them, in the phrase of his country, a Sloan. He was hurried off amid the laughter of the audience, but the indecorous scene which had taken place contributed to the abolition of the office of Dempster. The sentence is now read over by the clerk of court, and the formality of pronouncing doom is altogether omitted. The usage of calling the Dempster into court by the ringing of a handbell to repeat the sentence on a criminal is said to have been abrogated in March 1773. Note Ojon, Duke of Argyll and Greenwich. This nobleman was very dear to his countrymen, who were justly proud of his military and political talents, and grateful for the ready zeal with which he asserted the rights of his native country. This was never more conspicuous than in the matter of the Porteous mob, when the ministers brought in a violent and vindictive bill for declaring the Lord Provost of Edinburgh incapable of bearing any public office in future for not foreseeing a disorder which no one foresaw, or interrupting the course of a riot too formidable to endure opposition. The same bill made provision for pulling down the city gates and abolishing the city guard, rather a Hibernian mode of enabling their better to keep the peace within burgh in future. The Duke of Argyll opposed this bill as a cruel, unjust, and fanatical proceeding, and an encroachment upon the privileges of the royal burghs of Scotland, secured to them by the Treaty of Union. In all the proceedings of that time, said His Grace, the nation of Scotland treated with the English as a free and independent people, and as that treaty, my lords, had no other guarantee for the due performance of its articles, but the faith and honour of a British Parliament, it would be both unjust and ungenerous should this House agree to any proceedings that have a tendency to injure it. Lord Hardwicke, in reply to the Duke of Argyll, seemed to insinuate that His Grace had taken up the affair in a party point of view, to which the nobleman replied in the spirited language quoted in the text. Lord Hardwicke apologized the bill was much modified, and the clauses concerning the dismantling the city and disbanding the guard were departed from. A fine of L was imposed on the city for the benefit of Porteous' widow. She was contented to accept 3/4 of the sum, the payment of which closed the transaction. It is remarkable that in our day, the magistrates of Edinburgh have had recourse to both those measures held in such horror by their predecessors as necessary steps for the improvement of the city. It may be here noticed, in explanation of another circumstance mentioned in the text, that there is a tradition in Scotland that George Roman II, whose irascible temper is said sometimes to have hurried him into expressing his displeasure par voie du fait, offered to the Duke of Argyll in angry audience some menace of this nature. on which he left the presence in high disdain, and with little ceremony Sir Robert Walpole, having met the Duke, as he retired and learning the cause of his resentment and discomposure, endeavoured to reconcile him to what had happened by saying such was his Majesty's way, and that he often took such liberties with himself, without meaning any harm. This did not mend matters in Mac Callamore's eyes, who replied in great disdain, "You will please to remember, Sir Robert, the infinite distance. There is betwixt you and me another frequent expression of passion on the part of the same monarch, is alluded to in the old Jacobite song. The fire shall get both hat and wig, as oft times they've got o' that." Note P. Expulsion of the bishops from the Scottish Convention. For some time after the Scottish Convention had commenced its sittings, the Scottish prelates retained their seats and said prayers by rotation to the meeting, until the character of the Convention became, through the secession of Dundee, decidedly Presbyterian occasion, was then taken on the Bishop of Ross mentioning King James in his prayer as him for whom they watered their couch with tears. On this, the Convention exclaimed they had no occasion for spiritual lords, and commanded the bishops to depart and return no more. Montgomery of Skelmorley breaking at the same time a coarse jest upon the scriptural expression used by the prelate Davy Dean's oracle Patrick Walker, gives this account of their dismission. When they came out, some of the Convention said they wished the honest lads knew they were put out, for then they would not get away with hail-hole gowns. All the 14 gathered together with pale faces, and stood in a cloud in the Parliament close. James Wilson, Robert Neilson, Francis Hislop, and myself were standing close by them. Francis Hislop, with force, thrust Robert Neilson upon them. Their heads went hard on one another, but there being so many enemies in the city, fretting and gnashing the teeth, waiting for an occasion to raise a mob, when undoubtedly blood would have been shed, and having laid down conclusions amongst ourselves, to avoid giving the least occasion to all mobs, kept us from tearing off their gowns. Their graceless graces went quickly off, and there was neither bishop nor curate seen in the street. Thys was a surprising sudden change, not to be forgotten. Some of us would have rejoiced near them in large sums to have seen these bishops sent legally down the bow, that they might have found the weight of their tails in a tow to dry their tossels, that they might know what hanging was, they having been active for themselves, and the main instigators to all the mischiefs, cruelties, and bloodshed of that time, where in the streets of Edinburgh and other places of the land did run with the innocent precious dear blood of the Lord's people life and death of 3 famous worthies, Semple, etc., by Patrick Walker, Edin, 1727, pp. 72-73. Note Q. Half-hanged Maggie Dixon. In the statistical account of the parish of Inveresk, Val Roman 16 p. 34, Dr. Carlyle says no person has been convicted of a capital felony since the year 1728, when the famous Maggie Dixon was condemned and executed for child murder in the Grassmarket of Edinburgh, and was restored to life in a cart on her way to Musselburgh to be buried. She kept an alehouse in a neighbouring parish for many years after she came to life again, which was much resorted to from curiosity after the body was cut down and handed over to her relatives. Her revival is attributed to the jolting of the cart, and according to Robert Chambers, taking a retired road to Musselburgh, they stopped near Peffermill to get a dram, and when they came out from the house to resume their journey, Maggie was sitting up in the cart. Among the poems of Alexander Penicuik, who died in 1730, is one entitled The Merry Wives of Musselburgh's Welcome to Meg Dixon, while another broadside, without any date or author's name, is called Margaret Dixon's Penitential Confession, containing these lines referring to her conviction. "Who found me guilty of that barbarous crime, and did by law end this wretched life of mine? But God did me preserve," etc. In another of these ephemeral productions, hawked about the streets, called A Ballad by J.N.B.S., are the following lines. Please peruse the speech of ill-hanged Maggie Dixon. Ere she was strung, the wicked wife was sainted by the flamen priest. But now since she's retumdy to life, some say she's the old Saman. In his reference to Maggie's calling salt after her recovery, the author would appear to be alluding to another character who went by the name of Stout Maggie, and is represented in one or more old etchings about 1790. Note our Madge Wildfire. In taking leave of the poor maniac, the author may here observe that the first conception of the character, though afterwards greatly altered, was taken from that of a person calling herself, and called by others feckless Fanny Weak, or feeble Fanny, who always travelled with a small flock of sheep. The following account, furnished by the persevering kindness of Mr. Train, contains probably all that can now be known of her history, though many among whom is the author may remember having heard of feckless Fanny in the days of their youth. My leisure hours, says Mr. Train, for some time past, have been mostly spent in searching for particulars relating to the maniac called feckless Fanny, who travelled over all Scotland and England between the years 1767 and 1775, and whose history is altogether so like a romance that I have been at all possible pains to collect every particular that can be found relative to her in Galloway or in Ayrshire. When feckless Fanny appeared in Ayrshire for the first time in the summer of 1769, she attracted much notice from being attended by 12 or 13 sheep, who seemed all endued with faculties so much superior to the ordinary race of animals of the same species, as to excite universal astonishment. She had for each a different name to which it answered when called by its mistress, and would likewise obey in the most surprising manner any command she thought proper to give. When travelling, she always walked in front of her flock, and they followed her closely behind when she lay down at night in the fields, for she would never enter into a house. They always disputed who should lie next to her by, which means she was kept warm while she lay in the midst of them. When she attempted to rise from the ground, an old ram, whose name was Charlie, always claimed the sole right of assisting her, pushing any that stood in his way aside, until he arrived right before his mistress. He then bowed his head nearly to the ground, that she might lay her hands on his horns, which were very large. He then lifted her gently from the ground by raising his head. If she chanced to leave her flock feeding, as soon as they discovered she was gone, they all began to bleat most piteously, and would continue to do so till she returned. They would then testify their joy by rubbing their sides against her petticoat and frisking about. Feckless Fanny was not like most other demented creatures fond of fine dress on her head. She wore an old slouched hat over her shoulders, an old plaid, and carried always in her hand a shepherd's crook. With any of these articles she invariably declared she would not part for any consideration whatever. When she was interrogated why she set so much value on things seemingly so insignificant, she would sometimes relate the history of her misfortune, which was briefly as follows. I am the only daughter of a wealthy squire in the north of England, but I loved my father's shepherd, and that has been my ruin, for my father, fearing his family would be disgraced by such an alliance, in a passion, mortally wounded my lover with a shot from a pistol. I arrived just in time to receive the last blessing of the dying man, and to close his eyes in death. He bequeathed me his little all, but I only accepted these sheep to be my sole companions through life, and this hat, this plaid, and this crook, all of which I will carry until I descend into the grave. This is the substance of a ballad, 84 lines, of which I copied down lately from the recitation of an old woman in this place, who says she has seen it in print, with a plate on the title page representing Fanny, with her sheep behind her. As this ballad is said to have been written by Lowe, the author of Mary's Dream, I am surprised that it has not been noticed by Cromick in his Remains of Nithsdale and Galloway Song, but he perhaps thought it unworthy of a place in his collection, as there is very little merit in the composition, which want of room prevents me from transcribing at present. But if I thought you had never seen it, I would take an early opportunity of doing so. After having made the tour of Galloway in 1769, as Fanny was wandering in the neighbourhood of Moffat on her way to Edinburgh, where I am informed she was likewise well-known, old Charlie, her favourite ram, chanced to break into a kailyard, which the proprietor observing, let loose a mastiff that hunted the poor sheep to death. This was a sad misfortune. It seemed to renew all the pangs which she formerly felt on the death of her lover. She would not part from the side of her old friend for several days, and it was with much difficulty she consented to allow him to be buried, but still wishing to pay a tribute to his memory, she covered his grave with moss and fenced it round with osiers, and annually returned to the same spot, and pulled the weeds from the grave, and repaired the fence. This is altogether like a romance, but I believe it is really true that she did so. The grave of Charlie is still held sacred even by the schoolboys of the present day in that quarter. It is now perhaps the only instance of the law of Kenneth being attended to, which says, the grave where Annie that is slain lieth, buried leave untilled for 7 years repute, every grave holy, so as thou be well advised, that in no wise with thy feet thou tread upon it. Through the storms of winter, as well as in the milder seasons of the year, she continued her wandering course, nor could she be prevented from doing so either by entreaty or promise of reward. The late Dr. Fullarton of Rosemount, in the neighbourhood of Ayr, being well acquainted with her father when in England, endeavoured in a severe season by every means in his power to detain her at Rosemount for a few days until the weather should become more mild. But when she found herself rested a little, and saw her sheep fed, she raised her crook, which was the signal she always gave for the sheep to follow her, and off they all marched together. But the hour of poor Fanny's dissolution was now at hand, and she seemed anxious to arrive at the spot where she was to terminate her mortal career. She proceeded to Glasgow, and while passing through that city, a crowd of idle boys, attracted by her singular appearance, together with the novelty of seeing so many sheep obeying her command, began to ferment her with their pranks, till she became so irritated that she pelted them with bricks and stones, which they returned in such a manner that she was actually stoned to death between Glasgow and Anderston. To the real history of this singular individual credulity has attached several superstitious appendages. It is said that the farmer who was the cause of Charlie's death shortly afterwards drowned himself in a peathag, and that the hand with which a butcher in Killinarnock struck one of the other sheep became powerless and withered to the very bone. In the summer of 1769, when she was passing by New Cumnock, a young man whose name was William Forsyth, son of a farmer in the same parish, plagued her so much that she wished he might never see the morn, upon which he went home and hanged himself in his father's barn, and I doubt not that many such stories may yet be remembered in other parts where she had been. So far, Mr. Train, the author can only add to this narrative that feckless Fanny and her little flock were well known in the pastoral districts. In attempting to introduce such a character into fiction, the author felt the risk of encountering a comparison with the Maria of Sterne, and besides, the mechanism of the story would have been as much retarded by feckless Fanny's flock as the night march of Don Quixote was delayed by Sancho's tale of the sheep that were ferried over the river. The author has only to add that, notwithstanding the preciseness of his friend Mr. Train's statement, there may be some hopes that the outrage on feckless Fanny and her little flock was not carried to extremity. There is no mention of any trial on account of it, which, had it occurred in the manner stated, would have certainly taken place, and the author has understood that it was on the border she was last seen about the skirts of the Cheviot Hills, but without her little flock. Note S. Death of Francis Gordon. This exploit seems to have been one in which Patrick Walker prided himself not a little, and there is reason to fear that that excellent person would have highly resented the attempt to associate another with him in the slaughter of a King's Life Guardsman. Indeed, he would have had the more right to be offended at losing any share of the glory, since the party against Gordon was already 3-1, besides, having the advantage of firearms. The manner in which he vindicates his claim to the exploit, without committing himself by a direct statement of it, is not a little amusing. It is as follows. I shall give a brief and true account of that man's death, which I did not design to do while I was upon the stage. I resolve indeed, if it be the Lord's will, to leave a more full account of that, and many other remarkable steps of the Lord's dispensations towards me through my life. It was then commonly said that Francis Gordon was a volunteer out of wickedness of principles, and could not stay with the troop, but was still raging and ranging to catch hiding suffering people. Meldrum and Airlie's troops lying at Lanark, upon the 1st day of March, 1682, Mr. Gordon and another wicked comrade, with their 2 servants and 4 horses, came to Kilcagow, 2 miles from Lanark, searching for William Cagow and others under hiding. Mr. Gordon, rambling through the town, offered to abuse the women at night. They came a mile further to the Easterseat to Robert Muir's, he being also under hiding Gordon's comrade, and the two servants went to bed. But he could sleep none, roaring all night for women. When day came, he took only his sword in his hand, and came to Mossblatt and some new men who had been in the fields all night. Seeing him they fled, and he pursued. James, Wilson, Thomas Young, and myself, having been in a meeting all night, were lying down in the morning. We were alarmed, thinking there were many more than one. He pursued hard, and overtook us. Thomas Young said, Sir, what do ye pursue us for? He said he was come to send us to hell. James Wilson said, That shall not be, for we will defend ourselves. He said that either he or we should go to it. Now he run his sword furiously through James Wilson's coat. James fired upon him, but missed him. All this time he cried, Damn his soul. He got a shot in his head out of a pocket pistol, rather fit for diverting a boy than killing such a furious, mad, brisk man, which notwithstanding killed him dead. The foresaid William Cagow and Robert Muir came to us. We searched him for papers, and found a long scroll of sufferers' names, either to kill or take. I tore it all in pieces. He had also some popish books and bonds of money with $1, which a poor man took off the ground, all which we put in his pocket again. Thus he was 4 miles from Lanark, and near a mile from his comrade, seeking his own death, and got it. And, for as much as we have been condemned for this, I could never see how anyone could condemn us that allows of self-defense, which the laws both of God and nature allow to every creature. For my own part, my heart never smote me for this. When I saw his blood run, I wished that all the blood of the Lord's stated and avowed enemies in Scotland had been in his veins. Having such a clear call and opportunity, I would have rejoiced to have seen it all gone out with a gush. I have many times wondered at the greater part of the indulged lukewarm ministers and professors in that time, who made more noise of murder, when one of these enemies had been killed, even in our own defense, than of 20 of us being murdered by them. None of these men present was challenged for this, but myself. Thomas Young thereafter suffered at Mauchline, but was not challenged for this. Robert Muir was banished. James Wilson outlived the persecution. William Cagow died in the Canongate Tolbooth in the beginning of 1685. Mr. Wadrow is misinformed, who says that he suffered unto death. Note: teetotaling to service in Scotland. In the old days of Scotland, when persons of property, unless they happened to be nonjurors, were as regular as their inferiors in attendance on parochial worship, there was a kind of etiquette in waiting till the patron or acknowledged great man of the parish should make his appearance. This ceremonial was so sacred in the eyes of a parish beadle in the Isle of Bute, that the kirk bell being out of order, he is said to have mounted the steeple every Sunday to imitate with his voice the successive summonses, which its mouth of metal used to send forth. The first part of this imitative harmony was simply the repetition of the words bell, 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 bell 2 or 3 times in a manner as much resembling the sound as throat of flesh could imitate throat of iron. Bellum, bellum was sounded forth in a more urgent manner, but he never sent forth the third and conclusive peal, the varied tone of which is called in Scotland the ringingin, until the 2 principal heritors of the parish approached, when the chime ran thus: Bellum, bellellum, Bernera and Nocto's coming. Bellum, bellellum, Bernera and Nocto's coming, thereby intimating that service was instantly to proceed. Mr. Mackinlay of Borrowstowness, a native of Bute, states that Sir Walter Scott had this story from Sir Adam Ferguson, but that the gallant knight had not given the laird's titles correctly, Bellman's great men being Craich, Drumbuie, and Barnerney.